Are we ready to start the live stream? Madam Clerk?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, you're good to go.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. I now call the meeting of Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment to order. My name is Jacobson. I'm the MLA for Nunukput and the chair of the committee. Chair, the committee today will receive a public briefing with the Minister of Industry, Tourism, Investment, the Honourable Carolyn Wawzonek. Public received briefing with the Minister, the Honourable Carolyn Wawzonek, Staff Mineral Resource Act Regulations Implementation. Today, a public meeting will be live streamed on the public assembly. And media channels, all social media channels. I'd like to remind all members, presenters, I'll direct all questions and comments towards myself as the chair and wait to be recognized before speaking. To help me, we run this meeting smoothly. I'll now ask members to introduce themselves for the record.
Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
Katrina Knockleby, MLA for Great Slave.
Jane Wayellen Armstrong, MLA for Mofi.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Now welcome the Minister. Wawzonek, please introduce yourself and staff to proceed with your opening remarks and the presentation. Thank you. Ms. Wawzonek.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to meet with us today. I am very much looking forward to discussing the development and implementation of the Mineral Resources Act. I will be introducing all of those present shortly. We are here to present on what is one of the largest projects that Industry, Tourism and Investments, Mineral Staff and the Northwest Territories mineral sector has undergone. Due to the large nature of this change, to support our discussions, we do have quite a number of staff with us as subject matter experts. Beginning though first, I have Pamela Strand, Deputy Minister, with me on my right, and Menzie McEachran, Assistant Deputy Minister for Mineral Petroleum Resources, also here in the room with me, as well as Drew Robertson, Ministerial Special Advisor. On the line, we have Julie Ward, who's the Director of the Mineral Resource Act Implementation, and she'll be doing the presentation for you virtually in a moment. And as well, there are working group leads on the line and subject matter experts, including Charlene Squibb, Manager of Mineral Resource Planning, Diana Beck, Manager of Socioeconomics, and Jessica Boss, the Mining Recorder. I would also like to acknowledge that we are co-developing the policies for these regulations with Indigenous government partners with whom we sit on the Intergovernmental Council. I understand that we do in fact have representatives from the Intergovernmental Council today who are part of the technical working group collaboratively working on the Mineral Resources Act regulations. More specifically, Mr. Chair, we do have members here today from the Clicquot government, and the Clicquot government, of course, sits on the Intergovernmental Council. Mr. Zabi Nevitt and Ms. Bertha Rabeskazo, both in the room here today. Together, as a group, the Intergovernmental Council is working towards regulations that will support and be supported by the people of the Northwest Territories. It is my understanding that members of the Intergovernmental Council, or IGC, have expressed perhaps an interest in jointly participating with ITI staff in future presentations to SCEDI. I would acknowledge, of course, the current GWT briefing process is not conducive to this kind of joint briefing at present, but I certainly am open to working with my GWT colleagues in the Land and Natural Resources Departments, or L&R departments, along with the IGC and SCEDI, to explore a process that would enable joint standing committee briefings in the future where appropriate. A legislative project as large as the Mineral Resources Act is of course highly complex. This means we have a greater understanding of and ability to plan in detail both near-term priorities, such as the development of the regulations of the 19th Legislative Assembly, and implementation beyond. But I would like to acknowledge that there are a variety of implementation activities that will roll out over time. Some before the regulations are in place, and some longer-term implementation activities over time, given the need for certainty around the final regulations themselves. You will hear a few examples of these today. Implementation activities cover everything from policy and guidance documents for our clients, as well as for internal purposes, organizational design and resource planning needs, training for staff and clients, and design and implementation of data and information management systems such as MARS. With a legislative policy project like the implementation of the MRA, there is a need for a learn, plan, and adapt as we go approach. We do look forward to keeping Sketty updated with our MRA implementation planning as we advance this work. Today we hope to highlight some of the proposed policy changes, knowing that there is this adaptive process in developing and refining regulations, and the regulations may undergo a significant evolution as we move through this development. Mr. Chair, I'll pass it back to you and would ask that you please allow Ms. Julie Ward to give a presentation in advance of any Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wawzonek. Ms. Ward, proceed with your presentation. Thank you.
Can you please advance the slide? The work we are working towards is under the mandate commitments of increasing resource exploration and development and adopting a policy retention approach for economic development. Advance the slide, please. The following devolution of powers from the federal government to the territory in the 2014 and the Department of Industry, Tourism, and Investment became responsible for the administration of mineral activities on public lands. The governing legislation, the Northwest Territories Lands Act, and associated mining, coal, and dredging regulations were mirrored from the Federal Territory Lands Act. 5 years later, in 2019, the Northwest Territories created a standalone mineral legislation that enables various new authorities and functions to balance the Northwest Territories' unique interests. The Mineral Resource Act is primarily an enabling act that creates the abilities to develop and implement regulations for various aspects of exploration and development, and for ensuring that Northwest Territories mineral wealth is used to benefit people of the Northwest Territories today and into the future. Currently, regulations are being modernized and likely packaged through several separate regulations, including general regulations that focus on relationship building, creating engagement opportunities under the land access conditions, and the information gathering and transparency through the tenure system reporting requirements. Royalties regulations, the benefit regulations focusing on regulating benefit agreements and the NWT benefits, and the Mineral Rights Review Board.
Is she still on, Madam Clerk?
No, I think she seems to have been disconnected. Mr. Chair, just one moment, please.
Where Julie left off, the different types of regulations that will be under the Act. And she mentioned the royalties regulations, benefit regulations focusing on both regulating benefit agreements between Indigenous governments and proponents, as well as NWT benefits for socioeconomic agreements, as well as Mineral Rights Review Board regulations to allow for a quick resolution of disputes between parties in the system. So although currently placed under the Mineral Resources Act, the coal and dredging regulations may be mirrored from the current regulations until time allows to complete policy work and determine future needs for those regulations. So they were deemed lower priority at this time. Next slide, please. So the Act provides the enabling authorities in order to develop regulations which work towards achieving the following purposes. First of all, to regulate mineral interests efficiently, effectively, and in a transparent manner, and to support the economy of the NWT, to realize benefits from mineral development for Indigenous governments and organizations, communities, and the people of the NWT, and to ensure that wealth generated by mineral resources will be used for the benefit of present and future generations of the people of the NWT. Next slide, please. Continuing on with the purpose of the MRA, to encourage positive relationships between proponents, Indigenous governments and organizations, communities, and GNWT, to respect Aboriginal and treaty rights, to complement the systems for collaborative management of land and natural resources in the Northwest Territories, such as the board system under MVRMA, and to improve geological knowledge in the territory, and to recognize sustainable land use. Next slide, please. So creating and implementing regulations under this Act, as mentioned by the Minister, is the largest change that ITI mineral staff and the mining sector working in the NWT have undergone. To manage this work and the change, ITI is taking an integrated project and change management approach. So project management principles are being flexibly applied to defining, tracking, and monitoring the technical aspects of the project, whereas change management principles, which you can see on the bottom arrow on the slide, will be used to assist staff as well as our clients in undergoing these changes. So this is more of the human, the softer side of managing the changes that will happen. Next slide, please. So turning back to devolution in 2014 for a moment, the Northwest Territories Intergovernmental Agreement on Land and Resource Management and the associated Act were approved at that time. This agreement formalizes government-to-government relationships and allows for the further development of agreements or other arrangements among the GNWT and Indigenous governments for cooperative and coordinated management of lands and resources. In December of 2020, IGC on Land and Resource Management created the Legislative Development Protocol. This protocol identifies the steps to take for collaborative development of legislation, including regulations. ITI has been carrying out the development of these MRA regulations following the steps identified in this protocol. Step A, which is the invitation to participate, and Step B, determining the level of engagement, occurred early in 2021. The level of engagement was determined through a sort of red, yellow, green exercise with Intergovernmental Council Secretariat, which rated each area of the regulations with one of these colors. Red being a high level of participation desired, yellow being a medium level of involvement in the technical work desired, and then with green being a lower level of participation in the sort of technical sides of development considered or needed by members of the IGC for a specific policy area. So step E, which is establishment of a technical working group, took place in March of 2021, when we started to review the technical aspects or the policy aspects of the regulations. And then in December of 2021, IGC invited other Indigenous governments that are not signatory to the devolution agreement to participate in the technical working group, which continues until today. Next slide, please. So this chart just shows a brief example, and I won't be going into detail on this, but just an example on how the technical working group works through each aspects of the regulations on this collaborative approach. So this shows notification of application to record a mineral claim, which was originally identified as a red or a high level of engagement needed. And after sharing the policy research with the technical working group, ITI needed to then update this research with other considerations provided by members of the technical working group, and then reshare that new work with the group. Following this process, ITI shared various policy options, and then a recommendation that was discussed and acceptable to the broader technical working group was put forward and agreed to. So once that sort of it reaches that level of agreement, a policy intention document is created, which will help guide council in drafting the regulations in that particular policy area. Next slide, please. Now we're going to dive into some of these proposed policy changes occurring under the MRA. Next slide, please. Modernizing regulation includes regulating mineral interests or tenure efficiently and effectively from both an administrative sort of process perspective, as well as to reduce unnecessary burdens on proponents or companies. So it also includes increasing transparency within the tenure system. Next slide, please. The NWT Mineral Tenure Administration system is definitely in need of modernization, and the new MRA regulations combined with a new mineral administration and registry system, which is what we call MARS, will do just that. The more substantial changes include long overdue updates to work system regulations. The work system has not been updated since the mid-1970s and are out of alignment with other jurisdictions in Canada. Lack of updates has resulted in limited collection of public geoscience data, and consequently, we have not maximized the data available to industry and the data that would indeed help attract their investment. Additionally, our current tenure issuance system does not adequately address the relationships that we recognize are integral in how the mineral resource industry operates in the North. It lacks respect for the Indigenous people who have settled and asserted claims in the NWT. And so when the system doesn't work for all stakeholders, it simply doesn't work. We also need to rework the tenure system to move away from old and unnecessary conventions such as ground staking. Arbitrary claim lives and a lease issuance process that allows for leases to be held indefinitely and sterilizes land from explorers who want to invest and develop in the NWT. In order to address these modernization needs, the new tenure system will be based on what we call at the technical working group a merit-based tenure system rather than a strictly time-based system, which means that moving to the next stage of mineral tenure will be based on project progress rather than on an arbitrary time frame. For example, in order for a company to move from a mineral claim to a lease, they'll have to provide evidence that they've found a mineral deposit that could be mined. The technical threshold will be set to correspond what's called in the sort of industry language, NI 43-101 pre-feasibility technical report requirements. Certainly people don't have to know what that is or digest it, but it just means there's an official sort of standard that will be reached at this stage of the project life cycle. This will ensure that any lease issued will have technically proven that there is a real and quantifiable prospect of benefits for the people of the NWT to be issued. It's critical that the lease be issued at this stage, as the right to extract the mineral is transferred at this stage of the project life cycle. We'll also have a new tenure instrument called a production license. And that is, with a production license, a proponent will need to have this in order to sell minerals that will also link to benefit agreements as well as socioeconomic agreements and reporting requirements for this ability to sell minerals. Finally, on this topic, an important modernization step that most Canadian jurisdictions have already adopted and which industry has been asking for many years, is our move towards online map staking for mineral claims. This is much cheaper and in fact safer than staking claims on the ground in the field, and the data will be easier to manage being electronic. Next slide, please. Just turn it back. Do you want to pass or do you want me to continue? Chair, I understand that Julie Ward is back with us. We can turn it back to Julie if desired, or I can continue.
Yeah, it's up to you. Continue.
Okay. We're here looking at a graphic of the Mineral Administration system and throughout a project's life cycle. And it's meant to show how the different elements of the system will relate to each other in this merit-based system. As we see from this generalized diagram, transitions through the tenure system will align with the mineral project development or life cycle transitions. So it's essentially an overlay of the proposed mineral tenure system over the exploration and mining project life cycle. We've adopted a more detailed mining project life cycle for these purposes so that we can distinguish between the development phase and the construction phase of projects to allow us to pinpoint the appropriate timing of the tenure instruments in the life cycle, including the production license I mentioned. At the heart of this merit-based tenure system is evidence of deposit. And this requirement is the key to ensuring that lease issuance is limited to those projects with real economic potential. We will see a decrease in the number of leases issued under the new system, as proponents will now have sufficient time to evaluate their projects and the minerals therein before they must be released or taken to lease due to the resulting extended mineral claim life. This is in alignment with feedback received from both industry and Indigenous governments. Discovery, exploration, and technical evaluation will all be happening during this mineral claim phase. These shifts are what necessitate increasing the claim life significantly to incorporate all these stages of the project. And cross-jurisdictional and NWT analysis suggests that 30 years is a suitable time period for the extended claim life. Claims can, of course, go to lease earlier if they can meet evidence of deposit and it's economical to move to lease, or if they want to move into permitting and construction. This allows for the project to proceed to the lease stage on individualized timelines that work for different companies of different sizes and different types of projects and deposits, meaning that the tenure system is able to support the natural development timelines while simultaneously respecting Indigenous rights, minimizing lease issuance to projects that are not continuing to develop their claimed properties as well. Next slide, please. Ensuring benefits for Northerners is an essential goal in managing mineral resource activity in NWT. Benefits are achieved in a variety of ways. Not only are benefits obtained through royalties, benefits are also obtained through socioeconomic agreements and for the NWT residents, and benefit agreements between Indigenous governments and proponents. And these types of benefits include those associated with employment, those associated with business and contracting opportunities, or joint venture and equity opportunities, as well as other cultural well-being, traditional economy, community benefits, family and individual well-being opportunities. Agreements will be regulated under the MRA, ensuring that all mining projects that exceed a certain size will require socioeconomic agreements and benefit agreements. Socioeconomic agreements in particular will be regulated to standardized and required elements and commitments, removing uncertainty from the current processes, while leaving some room to negotiate based on the context of a specific project. Benefit agreements are, as I mentioned, private agreements between Indigenous governments and mining proponents, and the content of those agreements will not be regulated under the MRA. Regulations will instead simply require that benefit agreements be in place before a production license can be issued. Next slide, please. MRA regulations will include a number of elements that seek to support positive and collaborative relationships between proponents and Indigenous governments. One area for this is the Prospector's Awareness course, which will be required to issue a prospector's license, and it's meant to provide awareness to prospectors working in the NWT on topics such as acquisition and issuance of mineral tenure, field preparedness, climate and terrain, geology, Indigenous rights, and traditional territories, and the responsibilities of prospectors as stipulated under agreements with Indigenous governments. Notification of application to record mineral claims ensures that Indigenous governments and ultimately the public in the next phase of this work have the opportunity to be aware of and monitor claim staking activity in areas of interest within the NWT. Notification of application to record will be provided to Indigenous governments after the application has been submitted and before the claim gets recorded. It will also provide an opportunity for Indigenous governments to reach out to applicants to identify any concerns related to working in the area. This notification process will encourage applicants to develop positive ongoing relationships with Indigenous governments early in the mineral tenure cycle. Notice of intended work will provide Indigenous governments advance notice of mineral exploration work that's planned to occur within their areas of interest. This notification will ensure that Indigenous governments are aware of the work that's happening and aid in the development of ongoing relationships between proponents and Indigenous governments. Indigenous engagement credits will allow proponents to earn credit towards maintaining their mineral tenure through engagement efforts with the appropriate Indigenous governments. Engagement credits could be granted based on formal agreements between proponents and Indigenous governments or based on actual expenditures. How these credits will work is still being developed with IGCS partners. Collaborative relationships will also be encouraged during the production phase through clarifying, standardizing, and where appropriate, requirements for socioeconomic agreements and benefit agreements, and having a dispute resolution process that efficiently addresses issues in these areas. Next slide, please. This graph shows the difference between Natural Resources Canada reported NWT exploration expenditures in blue against the value of exploration work submitted to the Mining Recorder's Office here in NWT in orange through the work assessment process. The difference in values highlights that under the current regulations, we're missing an opportunity to collect geological data through the tenure system. The proposed new regulations see a robust reporting requirement through the tenure system, from claim issuance through to production, that will close this reporting gap and result in more geoscience data becoming public available for a variety of public benefits. Next slide, please. Our NWT Geological Survey collects and manages public geoscience data, information, and knowledge for the public benefit. So our regulations will improve several elements related to the collection of this geoscience data that will flow to the Geological Survey. First, an increase in work reporting requirements will be aligned with Canadian standards over the extended claim life I mentioned earlier. Improved data standards to improve the quality and consistency of data that proponents submit to the Geological Survey. Data standards will also increase the functionality of data, ensuring that good data integrity and minimizing the loss of data. Improving the way drill cores are managed. Drill cores are like a rock library that's generated by mineral exploration drilling. This will be addressed in field preservation regulations, reporting requirements, as well as improving public access to the drill core. Also, the regs will clarify how bulk samples should be managed. Bulk samples are small-scale production tests that proponents carry out as a step before deciding to construct a mine, to ensure that they have good understanding of the resource that will be mined. In the current regulations, bulk sample simply has a limit of the total value that can be removed from a mineral claim. The new regulations will see additional regulations put forward that also include reporting and monitoring mechanisms for all movement of minerals, because minerals are, in fact, as we know, a public good, and we need to know which minerals are removed and the value and location of the minerals. Statistical data will also be collected during the production phase of a mine, and it will feed many uses, including improved forecasting of royalties. Next slide, please. There are tools in the Act that Indigenous governments and NGNWT can collaboratively use to promote exploration activities in desired areas or temporarily restrict exploration in localized areas where sensitivities are found. Zones are defined areas where Indigenous governments and the GNWT work together to incentivize and attract mineral exploration. These areas are established through engagement and will signal to industry that there is support for exploration in the area. Incentives may be unique to each zone and may include reduced work requirements or exclusivity for prospecting. Temporary restricted areas will allow the designation of small tracts of land to be temporarily restricted from new mineral exploration. The area identified for restriction must have cultural, ecological, geological, archaeological, or historical significance. A temporary restricted area is meant to provide an option for swift deployment in cases where other mechanisms for restriction of interest may take longer to implement. This restriction period can last for a maximum of 2 years, during which a more permanent method of restriction must be sought. And you can see that these two areas are likely to be fairly complex in the policy development side of things, so it may take some time to work through the details. Next slide, please. While creating policy approaches for draft regulations with Indigenous governments, ITI has been and will continue to engage particularly with the mining and exploration industry, who are directly impacted by the changes. These engagements are essential to ensure regulations can be implemented and achieve the goals set out in the MRA. Other engagements are planned with regulators, boards, and agencies to prepare them for the upcoming changes and obtain their perspective and views that may not have been considered yet. Engagement is also planned to occur with the general public to see if there are other interested parties who would like to provide input into the regulations. And of course, we need to ensure that the regulations are coordinated with other GNWT departments, particularly Lands and Natural Resources departments, and with the federal government, where there's overlap, in implementation activities is likely. Next slide, please. This is our second last slide. This is a schematic of the proposed timeline. extensive work has been done on research and program reviews, and some work has occurred on engagement and collaborative development of policy approaches. Drafting has not yet started. Once drafting is mostly complete, ITI's focus will be on implementation activities, such as preparing for changes to positions, developing procedures and processes and guidance materials, implementation of the Mineral Administration and Registry System, or MARS, as the Minister mentioned, and transition planning and sequencing. These implementation activities will be happening concurrently to the regulations being circulated for Aboriginal consultation and finalized. Once regulations are finalized, ITI will start training staff for the system and the changes to the processes. And following these training and other implementation activities, the Act will then be able to come into force likely in the next Legislative Assembly. ITI is currently planning for the time needed for these implementation activities in order to understand when the Act can come into the force. So there is a little bit of uncertainty on the exact scheduling of that. Once policy approaches are known, and if they do require the Act to come into force, ITI can start to implement various specific areas. So it doesn't all need to be implemented as a 100% perfect package all at the same time. An example of this is the notification process for notifying Indigenous governments when an application to record a mineral claim is received at the Mining Recorder's Office, which is already starting to get rolled out through policy. Last slide, please, or last substantive slide. As mentioned, before we can bring this Act into force, we'll need to be ready to implement it. We're also, to help us with this implementation activity, we're developing logic models for the regulations and associated performance-based criteria, which will allow us to monitor and measure how well the regulations are achieving their goals once we roll them out. Implementation of the regulations will require all these new policies, directives, procedures for applications to process mineral leases and claims. It will require the MARS system, which is our digital system for managing mineral tenure. And that is, of course, a significant capital project on its own that is going forward as well. The new functions for ITI, I mentioned that there might need to be changes to job descriptions, but it also is an organizational sort of structure, design considerations needing to cover benefits, enforcement, dispute resolution, et cetera, under the MRA. So there may be organizational changes associated with those. And, of course, we'll be working closely with our clients, with Indigenous governments, and all stakeholders to understand these new processes and together figure out how to navigate these changes and be able to implement them as smoothly, efficiently, and effectively as possible. With that, that is the end of the formal presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for that presentation. Thank the Minister for that. Before we proceed, I'd like to recognize Rocky Simpson, Hay River South MLA. He's on the call with us, so welcome, Rocky. You've been here from the start, and I apologize for that. Members, any questions for the Minister and her staff? First on the list, I have Ms. Knockleby. Ms. Knockleby?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation. Always lots of information, and I'm pretty excited about this work going forward. I guess the thing that I'm the most excited about, though, is the MARS and the move to the online staking. So I'm glad to see that it's not at the end of your schematic of when things are happening, but it's going to be starting and hopefully rolling out soon. With that, I guess another piece I just want to comment on before I ask my question was that I'm glad to hear about the industry input and the sort of iterative process of all of this, and that there will be a lot of times for industry to come back and say maybe this isn't working and this is, and what's good and not. So I kudos to the department for building that into the process. My question is around borehole data specifically. I know that in the past, having done work, we've had to register at times with the Aurora Research Institute to get a permit. You know, companies and consultants all have lots of databases of borehole data and other geological data in the north. And so my question is, are we going to look to capture and integrate all of the existing data that's already out there? I know that we'll be moving forward capturing data, but I'm worried about what we've already got, and will we lose that? And then as well too, I would imagine a lot of the issue can be that sometimes it's proprietary. The consultants pay themselves for the lab work, and therefore it actually does not become the property of the GNWT. It stays with the consultant, and that's actually proven problems in the past when we've been doing environmental site assessments. So my question is two-part. Will we be looking to capture existing data that's already out there, and what are the sort of proprietary concerns around that? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Knockleby. Ms. Wawzonek?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I can sort of go ahead and say that we don't want to lose any data. We certainly don't want to be adding to the data, not losing to it. But I'd suggest this go to Charlene Squibb to maybe describe that in a bit more detail, please.
Thank you, Ms. Squid.
Thank you. The reporting requirements for the drill hole regulations will be forward-looking. Having said that, we currently do have a drill hole database that this reporting requirement will be integrated with. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Knockleby.
Thank you. Really short and sweet, so I do appreciate that. I get that there's going to be a huge glut of data out there, and then as well too that data is going to be very inconsistent across the board in the different ways that companies report and collect their data. So I guess my next question along those lines then, as part of that data, and I mean, I think you've already alluded to it, but will there be like a standardized template in the sense of everybody is going to be giving you the same looking data going forward? I actually think this will be really good because consultants like to borrow and take people from each other. So even just having some standards and what's the word I'm looking for, making everything uniform would be useful. So maybe just a few more comments along that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Knockleby. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I mean, Mr. Chair, we can't necessarily control the data that's coming in, but I know that that's not necessarily the question, but just given that I know we're on with the public, it's, we wouldn't be able to control what we get, but we can certainly try to do a better job of providing it on the public's facing side from our end, so that it's a little more accessible and usable. Again, I'd like to sort of suggest going back to Charlene to talk a little bit more about where we're at thus far. I mean, and we're at an early stage of some of the development. That's again, we want to be here now, but we want to come back. But just to speak about where we're at with templates, what the vision is for templates, what some of the next steps will be with developing those, with what that outward facing look will be, so that it is usable by the public, but also by those who would be in specialized industry. So over to Charlene, please, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Charlene.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The reporting for drill cores will incorporate actual data standards. These will be throughout all of the reporting requirements for technical data. It's intended to optimize the use of data by subsequent users. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from the members? Very good. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks for the presentation. I think it's probably fair to say that I've been waiting 3 years for this to get this kind of detail, so appreciate it. And I certainly have a better idea as to what's happening with the regulations now than before. So I wish that this had been made public about 2 years ago, but I understand that you have to work collaboratively with Indigenous governments, and that's not that's a legal requirement now as well. So, but I guess I want to talk about how the department, and I'm glad that we have some representatives from the Intergovernmental Council here, intends to try to work with a committee. As I said, I've been asking for this kind of information for at least 3 years, and finally get it now, but looks like you have a pretty compact timeline to try to get regulations done by maybe as early as the fall. And I'm curious to know how you think you can work with a committee. I don't want to stand up and I understand the difference between regulations and the Mineral Resources Act, but given the MRA basically gave the minister total discretion over all of these very important policy areas, all the details are going to be found in the regulations. So how does the minister see working with the standing committee to try to make sure that we're kept informed and appraised of what's happening in the development of these regulations? Like, I've heard that there's technical working group meetings, perhaps there's minutes from those meetings that are kept, there's policy research that is not being shared anywhere else, there's a policy intention document that seems to be generated when you reach some sort of consensus. Can any of this sort of stuff be shared with the committee so that we have some sense of what's going on? Because so far we haven't had anything. We've had some, and I will say that we did get a presentation on the royalty regs last week, which was helpful, but on the other stuff, it's been radio silence. So how does the minister intend to try to work with the committee and keep us informed as this goes along? And I don't think briefings, every 3 or 4 months is probably going to cut it. I think we're going to need something in writing. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, we're happy to be here too, so I'm glad to get the warm welcome after a few years. Look, there's always opportunities to improve processes. Right now, the legislative development protocol that we have with Intergovernmental Council needs to be, adhered to, and that's the process that we're well into. This is the first major opportunity to utilize that, and I think everyone, I don't want to speak for everyone at IGC, I can certainly speak for our department. I think we're really proud to be leading that way. This is, I think, something that will put us on the map in Canada to be really showing the opportunities that exist to do things differently and to govern differently. It would not be particularly unusual. In fact, I'd suggest it might actually be a little unusual for the government to be, opening up all the doors to the policy side of what we do day in and day out. It's, a lot of it is very operational. I like to think I'm a fairly involved and engaged minister, but I'm not going to suggest that I know the inside or out of how to do borehole data. So, this is why we have the team we have here today, is because a lot of this is very technical and is, into the weeds in the way as it should be, to really get into how this is going to be managed at the front lines. So, I'm saying all that because I just want to sort of make it clear that we're not doing anything unusual, in my view. We're not developing regulations in a way that is outside of the norm. We are actually doing something very distinct and very unique by taking the legislative development protocol with IGCS and really running with it and making it into something meaningful and important and valuable. So as far as what we can do further with standing committee, I like to again think that in general that I have in the last few years tried to make myself available and the team available and tried to work in a way that is different. I hear that coming to a briefing is but one tool, providing, and I have on other occasions and in other contexts provided written updates to committee, whether it was in the context of COVID or floods or otherwise. So happy to do that again. We've had more than one briefing on the royalties part of this, and happy to break out other parts if that's beneficial to have more focused briefings on specific elements. That certainly is an option that I'd be more than welcome to entertain. And as I said at the very beginning, I gather there's an outstanding request with IGCS to perhaps have them involved and have a briefing on that front in terms of that work, what it looks like, and how that is coming together. And that, again, that's a little bit different than how we've done things here, but it's consensus government and we can always continue to evolve, and I would look forward to that opportunity. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Mr. O'Reilly.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks for that. I think committee probably needs to put our mind to what sort of information we would find helpful coming out of from the process that you described. So it is a two-way flow. So I guess I want to turn, though, to how you envision engaging the public. I saw from the slides that you've been engaging industry folks since January, and I think you probably need to engage them as clients, as you call them. But the public seems to be confined to a period from May to July. That's not a great time to try to consult with anybody necessarily, but what sort of public engagement do you see having with the public? And when I say the public, I cast my mind back to the Mineral Resources Act, and some of the more substantive submissions that were received were from, the Northwest Territory Association of Communities. Some of the environmental organizations made submissions, chambers of commerce, if I remember correctly. How do you envision, engaging those people? Only May to July, and when you've been talking to industry since January, are you going to hold workshops on each of these sets of regulations, or people have to ask you to be engaged? What about all the research that you're doing that has not been released anywhere? Is that going to be shared with the public? I guess I'd like some more details about how the department intends to engage the public. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Chair, the doors to ITI generally are, I'd say, always open. I do realize there's a difference between a formal engagement process, such as, having the May to June that we're describing here, and I'll go to Julie in just a moment. She's the director of the project, so she can speak a bit to what that will look like for any members of the public who might be listening or might tune in later. I do want to emphasize this isn't a closed door process, and folks are certainly welcome to reach out if they have a particular interest. A lot of what is being done is quite technical, and I'll use the example of the royalties piece, in that there was a fairly detailed and substantive research paper prepared, went back through both standing committee and IGCS and reworked that into a discussion paper that was a bit more manageable for non-technical experts. So, and that challenge is true throughout a lot of the different pieces here. So I don't want to discourage anyone. I want to encourage people, but, individually, piece by piece, a lot of it will be quite technical. So that's, just to kind of, we're not trying to not engage with people. I think there just needs to be a realistic approach as to what people will be engaged on and where their areas of interest are. But if there's a particular area of interest, then again, certainly doors are going to be open. But I suggest, if I could, Mr. Chair, that Julie can describe a bit more of what the formal public engagement piece is expected to look like. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Julie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to first comment that there are plans to use the public engagement portal to allow for public to engage on the major policy change pieces. The timing from May to July is arranged to allow it to feed into the drafting instructions. After the July frame, we hope to have our drafting start, and then our drafting piece would inform our regulation, and then after a proposed regulation has been put together, there will be a public requirement for posting those draft regulations at the latter end of the process. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Ward. Next on the list, I have Ms. Knockleby.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the offer. I'm going to take it as an offer of having us chat with the Intergovernmental Secretariat. I think when they came and presented to us before, it was very useful, and I look forward to actually having those conversations. I think you need to have a conversation with us. you need to have a conversation with them. So it's always easier if all of us are talking at the same time so that, everybody knows what everybody is saying and we're on the same page. So I do look forward to that. My question is around the reporting. And again, I'm sort of hung up on the data because as a former consultant, I'm excited for the idea that people could be able to just click on things in the computer and find historic data. So I guess my question is, how does that public reporting piece look like? And what sort of levels of access will people have? And I guess along the lines of my earlier questioning, this seems to me another great way to increase employment of getting maybe summer students or youth to digitize some of our previous data. And perhaps there's some funding and grants we can find elsewhere about keeping youth employed and a way to sort of, get rid of that backlog, because again, I know that nobody wants to lose data, and I get we can really only move forward from here. However, I think there's a lot of importance there. And I just come back to doing environmental site assessments and such where, I told the government they found there was a tank there that they never knew had been there before just from an air photo. So this kind of data is very important. So if the minister could speak to that, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Knockleby. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madam Chair, or Mr. Chair, sorry, one of the more critical areas of change here is on the public registry, and I'm going to suggest that this one go to Charlene Squibb to describe what is in that registry, how it works, and why this might hopefully answer some of the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Ms. Knockleby.
Ms. Squibb.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The public registry ensures that...
Sorry.
The public registry provides a public-facing platform to be able to access the data that's collected from the MRO. Having said that, the access to public data is expanded to the data that's collected through the reporting that's collected in the regulations. And that data, although it is subject to confidentiality timelines, will be made available through the NTGS as it becomes available, as it matures through the system.
Thank you, Ms. Knockleby.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm sure you're not going to let me see assay data before, financial pieces have been completed. So I'm pretty excited about that. And I guess just further to that, as we get to more online, then, we always know that exploration companies are sort of living by dollar. So more money, less money spent on staking is more money spent on further exploration. So I'm pretty excited about all of this work. I guess that's it. I don't really have a question. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for your comment, Ms. Knockleby. Mr. Simpson, do you have any questions? Hearing none. Do we have any other questions going on the message board?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I just want to ask about, I got a whole bunch of questions, and I'd be happy to meet offline with these folks at some point, because I've spent a good part of my adult life here studying these matters. So, when the draft regulations are posted, that's kind of a little late to be trying to solicit public opinion. I would hope that there's going to be a lot more effort put into engaging interested stakeholders before that. But when these draft regulations are posted, do people have, are their comments public? Does the department actually intend to respond in some way? Is there going to be a what we heard report? I don't know. Some of this is probably going to be fairly technical legal language and back and forth and so on, but how does the department see that process going, and how transparent will it be, and so on? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, just to start, I'm happy to find some time to sit down with Emily O'Reilly. We did do that on, I think, on the royalties piece a long time ago. It doesn't mean we're necessarily going to agree, but it's beneficial certainly to me, to the Met, and to the department to better understand what some of the different perspectives are. So happy to make that as a sort of side commitment, if I might. But then beyond that, as to what the putting out of the draft regulations are, I do want to suggest that the May to July timeframe is the first place I would really hope that folks would get involved, so that before we get to the point of drafting, we are getting a sense of perspective that we can incorporate in the actual draft itself. And also that way, in terms of being at the table with the IGCS, we would rather, I think it would be much easier to be able to sit down with our partners and to be able to evaluate and review what other information we've received collectively before we have to put the pen down to paper. Once the pen's down, that certainly does, that's a different stage of the process. But yeah, after that, I mean, again, and this isn't a bill. This isn't something that goes through the formal process of a bill or a development of a bill. But even in that process, there are always opportunities for pieces of draft legislation to be changed before they are formally enacted. And I would suggest that there's not going to be anything different here, that if once everything's taken into account and the words put on paper, it's realized that perhaps they're not capturing what is reflected, whether in the public feedback, whether from industry feedback, then certainly we would be able to still go back before anything is formalized and make those amendments. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Mr. O'Reilly?
Yeah, thanks for that. I guess it's just not clear to me what happens with comments, whether they're public or not, whether the department actually intends to respond in any way, and whether that is made public, and how you're going to work with the Intergovernmental Council and all of that. But yeah, if there's ways to increase the transparency around that, I would certainly encourage that. I want to go back, though, and ask about the non-Intergovernmental Council Indigenous governments. Who's actually at the table? Are they being funded or supported in any way? And if there are parties that are not at the table, if you can explain why and what's being done to try to encourage their participation or get input in some way from them. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Chair, so the Intergovernmental Council Secretariat is where the working group work is taking place. So I'd like to turn that over to Julie Ward, please, to speak more to where that's at. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Ms. Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since December, when the Intergovernmental Council Secretariat invited the Indigenous governments to participate in the process, we've had to identify their interest in participating, and they continue to participate today. We are, ITI is currently funding both of those participants, their technical staff only, to participate in the process. So we cover their technical staff costs. The other governments that have not requested to participate or have not accepted the participation, we will continue to offer other engagement opportunities to them. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. My screen is frozen. Do I have any other questions from members on the message board? Please just put a thumbs up. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I guess I'm trying to find a way to find out who is at the table and who's not. And if you want to tell me that separately, that's fine. I don't want to embarrass any Indigenous governments or whatever, but I guess I would like to have a clear sense of who's at the table and who's not at the table. So if you want to provide that information later, that would be really great. On slide 12, which is a very interesting slide, I'd never seen this before. I think it's actually quite helpful in understanding where you folks are going with this. I got a bunch of questions around this. Maybe a couple of quick ones if I can. It sounds like the evidence of deposit sort of milestone is equivalent to a significant declaration discovery in the oil and gas world. Is that kind of the equivalent? I'm looking at Mr. McEachran because he knows the oil and gas side, but it seems to me that's kind of equivalent. So that's one question. The second one is on the socioeconomic agreements. Section 52 of the MRA was so broad during the drafting and passage of this that I was opposed to this. It says that the Commissioner, on the recommendation of the Minister, may prescribe requirements in respect of measures that provide benefits to the people of the Northwest Territories. Now, if you can't get any vaguer language than that, or somebody could get a prize for vaguer language than that, but that means that, the department, or GWD, could reach back to anywhere in the mining cycle and start demanding benefits of some sort. So it seems like we've narrowed this down a bit, which is what I had hoped to do with proposed amendments back when we were looking at the MRA, to confine this to socioeconomic agreements that are triggered by a production license. Is that the approach we're taking? We're not looking at reaching back any further. Sorry, so there's two questions, Mr. Chair, and I had to try to jam them in about this one diagram. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Chair, we've got a few folks who could potentially get into this in a bit more detail. First, let me just start with this is not something I'd like to sort of stop right now on any attempt to compare to significant discovery licenses or the oil industry. This is really meant to be something specific to the mining life cycle and the mineral resources life cycle. So, I mean, I appreciate that sometimes seeing some similarities can make it sometimes easier or familiar, but I would urge to not think of it that way, but to link it to the mineral resource life cycle that goes from an exploration of a mineral resource to the production or to a producing mine. And the effort here is to tie stages of the Mineral Resource Act regulations to the actual meaningful stages of getting from staking a claim to the point of having, the mine that's actually producing. So rather than just markers of time. So that's the takeaway from this slide. That's one of the major takeaways from this slide. Now, as for Section 51, Section 51 shouldn't, of course, be read on its own. Section 51 is, enters into the provision on Part 5. Part 5 continues on, next section is Section 52, to get into what the impact benefit agreements provisions are, which really is the purview of Indigenous governments who are themselves engaged in those agreements. And then there's provisions later on about the potential for a dispute resolution body. But again, that to the extent that this section speaks to what are known as IBAs or impact benefit agreements, again, really that we're codifying that exists, but we're not going to be prescribing. That is really the business of Indigenous governments. But on that. I think there was a lot that was being asked. So let me just see and pause for a moment. Diana Beck is on for us with respect to this area of the Act, and I'll see if she has anything to add. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Ms. Beck.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As to the questions regarding the vagueness of what is in the Act, the regulations does provide the opportunity to narrow what that entails, and that's the opportunity we have taken here. And as to the question of whether or not this codifies socioeconomic agreements, that would be the case. We are looking to require socioeconomic agreements prior to the issuance of any production license, and will be part of the reporting would be improved reporting and monitoring to allow for some performance measurements and better access to adaptive management opportunities. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Beck. Mr. O'Reilly.
Yeah, thanks. I don't think I really got any answers, but I think it's probably part of a longer conversation. I guess I would like to ask about the work requirements. There's another slide on here which is very interesting about the amount of exploration work, the value of that versus the amount that's actually reported as work in the work assessment reports that's on slide 15. So, and I think it's in everyone's interest to actually have most, if not all, of the work that's done on mining claims reported, the geological part of that. So does this mean that we would actually be increasing the amount of work that's required to keep claims in good standing, but also recognizing that more could be submitted or more has to be submitted? Are we going to increase the amount of work that's required to keep claims in good standing? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Chair, yes, we are changing really to align with what's happening in Canada-wide right now. And I would just suggest, if I could, for any more detail, to, I think, Charlene on this one, please.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Minister. Charlene.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the determination of work requirements, we took a look at the pan-Canadian setting for work requirements and really looked at how we could close the gap between us and other jurisdictions. We determined we are going to be increasing work requirements. The work requirements increase are being developed through economic modeling, alignment with MRA goals. These two factors compound themselves to see a significant increase of work requirements. When you couple this with the extension of the claim life, you will see an increase of work. We will see the gap close in that graph we have on the slide in this presentation.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. So I've heard that the department is doing a lot of research to delve into a number of policy issues here, map staking, probably this area that I just talked about, the reporting of work that's done on mining claims. How much work has the department done, and is any of this going to be released to the public so that they can have better informed input into some of these policy matters that were not determined or left unresolved through the discretion that the minister has in the Mineral Resources Act. So how much of that research has been done, and can we get a list of it, and how much is it that is actually ever going to get released to the public? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Madam Minister.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I think I would suggest this is an appropriate one for me to sit down and make a bit more of a list on. I mean, you've seen, well, I'm quite proud of the slides that we have with various arrows and overlays, and I think they're very clear. At the same time, I think what they also convey is the complexity of everything that's underway here. Some research can certainly be released. Some research is internal work that happens in a government. Let me get a list of what we were at, where we're at on each one, and we can start to put some more pieces out. Yeah, well, as appropriate, and after I've had a chance to review that. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm conscious of the time. I don't want to keep our friends here for the rest of the day, but I could probably keep them here all weekend. But I want to, this notice of intended work, it was never really clear to me whether that is going to be made available to the public. And part of the reason for, I guess through Mars at some point there might be some ability for people to subscribe, because only Indigenous governments will be able to receive notification, even though we tried to get community governments into that, at least in terms of their geographic boundaries. Or infrastructure, even that might be outside of boundaries in some case. But the idea is to try to avoid land use conflicts. So if people have cabins somewhere or are using a recreation area or something, and a company's going to go in there and do some work, then is there a way to try to avoid land use conflicts? So this notice of intended work, is that going to be a public document, or is it going to be available to the public to try to avoid land use conflicts? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Chair, there are potentially different things at stake here. There's the notice of application to record. There's a notice of intended work. So there's different stages depending where a particular proponent might be in their stage of work. And so again, I don't want to get to be in error on which part we might be at. But notice of intended work does go to Indigenous governments, goes to Indigenous governments first. There are then, of course, pieces that go onto the public registry. There certainly are provisions within the Act around what is to be confidential, and when, and how confidentiality can be lifted, for example, upon written notification or upon written consent from a party. I don't know if I'm entirely answering the question, but only because I want to make sure I know when I was reviewing the materials that there's different stages where there's different notice to different, depending on where we're at. But certainly, I agree with the comment that the intent is to avoid conflicts and to not only avoid them, but actually not have them in the first place, but to create a structure such that through encouraging early engagement and often engagement, that there's more opportunities for everyone to understand what is happening in the industry, what a proponent is doing when they are on Indigenous lands, so that Indigenous governments are engaged from the beginning and comfortable, and that decisions can be made from an early stage whether or not something should continue or whether it should not. So again, bit of a long answer, Mr. Chair, and I too have other places I would like to be eventually today. So I'll stop there. If I've not answered correctly which stage or which notice we're talking about, Mr. Chair, I've had everyone is quickly typing away to me about all the things they could say about it. So I would look forward to a chance to sit down with Emily O'Reilly and make sure that we've fleshed that out correctly. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Minister. Whatever you are going to be putting in paper, maybe to send it to the committee, and we could have a commitment with that for any outstanding questions that we couldn't get answered today. Okay, Mr. O'Reilly, one last one.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Well, I don't know, zones. This was a contentious area in the Mineral Resources Act. And I think I heard the minister talk about how there could be reduced work requirements, and then I didn't catch the second way of trying to attract mining companies into areas. But I guess I'm worried about a race to the bottom, where you have regions, communities trying to compete against each other to attract investment, exploration dollars from the mining industry by having lower and lower and lower standards or lower and lower work requirements. How are you going to try to prevent a race to the bottom? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Chair, this is an area that is with IGCS, and it's one where their involvement, as with everything, is crucial, but this is an area that's still under development with them. So I just want to caution that I'm really not in a position to make any sort of statements, since that work is happening with those partners at that table. But I would, in a general sense, say that the goal with the zones is to incentivize an opportunity for proponents to be better engaged with Indigenous governments. I spend a lot of time explaining why it is my view that we have an opportunity here, and I like to say that we're a good entity, a good jurisdiction already with environmental, social, and governance factors, but we have an opportunity here to actually be truly leaders. And the zones would be one tool in that toolbox. And then beyond that, Mr. Chair, in terms of what that tool is going to look like and how shiny it'll be, I'd like to just defer and wait till IGCS has done some of their work, and to coming back to explore where that's at. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I better stop there. But I appreciate the answers, and I think, I'm going to take the minister up on a chance to meet with her and her staff offline, because there's a lot of other issues that I want to walk through. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Any other members have any other questions for the minister? Hearing none, thank you for your presentation. I'll now Thank the Minister for joining us today. This concludes our public portion of our meeting, and everyone have a safe weekend. Thank you, Madam Minister Wawzonek.